Hey everyone, I hope you all are doing good and having a wonderful day. In this video, we are going to talk about one of the most interesting vulnerability that is often overlooked by most of the penetration tester and most of the cybersecurity researchers who are doing penetration testing, bug bounty hunting, etc. Right? Which is none other than a vulnerability known as insecure deserialization. We're going to understand everything about it from the basics, like what it is, and we'll try to see why it happens and how we can prevent that, of course, and then we'll try to see that how we can actually find these kind of vulnerability. Okay, but before diving deep into this video, if you haven't checked out my previous video, then go ahead and check it out. The link is given in the description, as well as you can see it at the right side of the screen. And now, with that being said, let us get started. Okay, so before we dive deep into this video, we first need to understand what is serialization and deserialization means, right? And before that, we need to understand the concept of object and classes, right? This is very important because when we're talking about insecure deserialization, we should know what a class and object is, because everything is revolving around this particular topic. Okay, so let's try to understand this in a very simplest term possible if you are very new to these terms. Okay, so assume that there's a researcher who has created the very first Xbox 360, right? Now we obviously know that the very first Xbox 360 is a single piece thing, right? Because obviously that was the first thing which was released, right? And then once you have that Xbox 360 released, what happens is the company produces multiple Xbox 360 by taking inspiration from that, or you can say replicating that same properties of the first Xbox 360 created, and it is replicating that in the masses, right? It can be with anything. For example, let's say when Apple creates a new iPhone, it first creates a single phone, right? And then all the other phones are going to be the duplicate of that particular phone, like all of the features, all of the functionalities and everything is going to be the exact copy of the very first model of the brand new phone created by Apple, right? So the very first phone which was created over there, or the very first Xbox 360 which was developed ever, was known as class, right? That was the actual class. And then the rest of the Xbox 360s and the rest of the phones are known as objects. Okay, it is as simple as that. I hope you guys are able to understand what I'm trying to say, right? So the very first thing is going to be defining the blueprint for the objects, right? For example, what the properties will be. For example, let's say that I want to create a user, then what the properties of the user is, like whether they have like a username, a password, email address, something like that. And if we don't go with the technical terms, you can think of like the very first class of a human will be that a human is going to be having two eyes, one nose, lips, brain, head, two ears, and so on and so forth. And then once we have that property defined, we are going to create blueprint of those same properties, and we're going to create object in masses, right? So that's what you basically call classes and objects. I hope you guys are able to understand this. Okay, so if you're able to understand this, we can go ahead and try to understand what this code is over here. So you can take a look at this, that I'm creating like a simple class in Python. Okay, so the class name I have set it as user. Okay, then this user is having a username. Okay, then this user is going to have some methods. Okay, so we can check whether a user is admin or not. So this is like a small method that I have created. If the username is equals to admin, then return true, which basically means it is admin, otherwise it is not an admin. Like, this is a very simple code that I have actually created. Okay, now this is what you call a class, right? And now over here, if you take a look at it, I have created a variable named user, and then I am creating an object of the class which is user. Which is this particular user, right? And this is what you call, like, this particular thing over here, this is what you call an object, right? Which is basically inheriting all the properties and all the methods and everything that we have defined into this class, right? So now this object is going to be having all the features of the class that we have defined. And then you can see that I have initialized the username as Fayaz, because as you can see, it accepts a username. And then once you have created this user, what happens is that this particular code gets executed, and then it's going to save our username into this particular variable, and then I'm trying to see whether this particular user is an admin or not. And as we all can see that this user name is not equals to admin, so it's going to return false for us, right? So if we go ahead and save this and if we try to run this like this, let me just clear everything up, python 3 class.py, and you can see it says false. Right, so it's as simple as that. This is what you call, like in very simplest term, this is what you call classes and objects. Okay, so for example, if we change the user to, you know, let's say we are going to create another object, user2, we'll say user, and I will give it admin. Okay, and this time if we are going to print user2, the new object is admin. And if go ahead and run this, you can see for the second one it gave true. Why? Because the second object has the name admin, and when in the is admin method, it is clearly mentioning that if the username is equals to admin, we are going to return true, right? So it is as simple as that. Now I can create like multiple objects of the same classes, similar to how we can create multiple copies of a single Xbox 360 or a single iPhone that has been ever created, right? So this is what you call classes and objects, right? Now what happens is, like in if you talk about real world, what happens is that many times you want to share this class information, or not class, many times what happens is that you want to share this object to another program or another software to evaluate it further. For example, let's say that there is an application, you know, which is allowing us to do some task. If you are an admin or if you are a normal user, then you are allowed to do a particular set of tasks only, right? So how they are going to identify it? Let's say that this application is hosted on bpractical.tech, and the second application which I'm talking about is hosted on abc.bpractical.tech, right? And we are creating the user from the main domain. So how they're going to understand whether this particular user is admin or not? So what we can try to do is, we can try to send this particular object, you know, to that application, and then that application is going to call this method to verify whether this is this user is admin or not, right? Now the issue is, the main issue is try to understand. So we are only able to understand whether the user is admin or not by actually running the code, right? And we all know that when we try to run a code, what happens is that your code is getting stored into random access memory and what you call RAM, right? And now we all know that if it is stored on a, for example, local storage, so we can simply do like a CP or something, we can copy this file or something like that, right? But how we are going to copy the object and send it to the other application, you know, because it's stored in RAM, it's not in ROM, right? This is where we are going to use a concept which is known as serialization. So we are going to convert the data, the object which is present inside the RAM, you know, into bytes, and then we are going to store the bytes into our disk, something like that. And then we are going to transfer that byte, okay, so transfer that byte to the other program or any other place where we want to send the bytes, and then that program is going to do the exact opposite. So it's going to load the object from the bytes that we have given. It's going to load that into the RAM, and then it's going to understand what exactly is happening over here, right? And then it will be able to understand what the code is, right? So this is what you call serialization and deserialization. So when you try to convert the object into streams or bytes, a stream of bytes basically, that's what you call serialization. And when you're trying to load this stream of bytes and convert this into objects at runtime, that's what you call deserialization, right? I hope you guys are able to understand this. I mean, if you guys have any issues in this understanding, I can fully understand that, and you can leave out your issues into the comment section so that I'll be able to evaluate it further, right? And with that being said, let's try to understand where can the vulnerability lie if this is not happening properly. Let's try to understand that as well. Okay, so let us try to understand what serialization is and how we are going to do it in Python, for example. So you can see this is the library which is pickle, which is going to do most of the job for us. Then we are basically going to convert that stream of bytes into string using base64 so that we can transfer it very easily, you know, or save it on disk, whatever. Then we have this class. This particular class doesn't have anything interesting, it's just storing the username. That's it. Then we are taking the username from the user. Then once we have that username by the input of the user, we are basically creating an object of the class user, right? And over here we are trying to convert this object into stream of bytes, okay? And then we are converting the stream of bytes back into text using base 64 encode. So once we'll do that, we'll have a string base 64 encoded string that is the serialized data of this particular object, this particular object. And you see, since this is an object created by the class user, it's going to inherit all the properties and feature of user. For example, the username variable, or in the previous example, if we had like is admin or something like that, it's going to inherit everything like that. Okay, so and once we'll do that, we'll get a text. So let's just go ahead and try to execute this. So python 3 code.py, we basically want to serialize the data, and we're going to enter the username. For example, I'll go ahead and type Fayaz, and you can see this is the final output, which is the serialized data in text, okay, of the object which has the username Fayaz. Right now I can transfer this particular serialized data to any other application, and when we try to deserialize it over there, the object will be loaded. Okay, it's as simple as that. I mean, there are a little more technicalities to it, but consider this is how it is working. Once we have the serialized data, what we also want to do is, like, from the other end, we want to deserialize the data as well, right? And to do that, what we can simply do is we can go to code.py. Let's try to deserialize it, and we're going to paste this particular code over here. Okay, paste it like this, and now the data has been deserialized, right? We're not seeing anything because we are not actually printing anything. So let's try to go ahead and print out something to validate few things. Okay, the very first thing that I'm going to show you, that once we have this user created with the username, right, we'll try to, let's create another method, a very simple method, def is admin. Okay, just to show you guys what exactly it is. So we are going to say if self.username again is set to admin, then what we'll basically do is we'll return true, else we are going to return false. Very simple thing. Okay, then we have this user. So obviously we are going to just do a little bit of print here, user.is admin. Okay, and save everything else. Now we all know that if we serialize the data and if we enter the username Fayaz, we should see a message false, right? Okay, so yeah, what we are basically seeing over here is the object address, because I have to actually call this method. Just a second, like this. And if we do this now, if we type the user Fayaz, you see we are seeing false, and this is like the serialized data of the object, right? And again, if we go ahead and try to serialize the data and let's say admin, we'll see true, right? So that's the object that we have created, which is now serialized, and we have this particular data, right? And now we'll go to this code again and we'll try to understand how we are deserializing the data. Okay, so this is the code which is deserializing the data. So we are basically accepting the the input from user. It is a string which is basically a plain text. Then we are decoding the base 64, because remember previously we were encoding the data so that we can convert the bytes into string, Then we are basically now, instead of dumping the data to us, we are loading the object into the RAM, right, into the application itself, right? And then we are simply quitting it, right? So we'll simply go ahead over here, since we know that once we load this particular object, we know that this object is going to have a method which is admin, right? So we can simply go ahead and call d_obj dot is admin, right, like this, and we are simply going to save this. Now if, for example, let's try to run the code. If we are going to paste this serialized data, we all know that this serialized data is the object of user whose username is admin, right? So it should print true, correct? So let's copy this, let's paste it right over here, hit enter, and as you can see, it has printed true, which means that the simple text that we have given it actually converted that text into bytes, and then the bytes back into the object, and then it was able to call out the property that we have defined, which was is admin, right? So now we are able to serialize the data, which we did over here, and now we are also able to deserialize the data, right? Now you may be thinking that, okay, we now understood how we can serialize and deserialize the data. What's the issue here, right? The issue is that if you are taking the user input as it is and you are deserializing the user input, this can go horribly wrong. How so? Let's try to understand with the next example, in which I'm going to show you that how this deserialization can lead to remote code execution. Let's go ahead and see that. So finally, let us try to go ahead and let's try to understand that how this particular issue where the application is deserializing the input given by the user can be very impactful and can be very dangerous. Okay, so for that, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to import a library which is known as OS. Let me just import that, import OS. Once we have that library imported, I'm going to create a new class, and then we're going to create a serialized object of that particular class. Let's name it anything, ABC, and then we're going to create a very specific method or a very specific function, which is underscore reduce underscore and self. Okay, this particular function is actually very interesting. Why, you may be asking? Because when we are trying to deserialize the data, for example, you can see, so, when we are trying to load the data from the user input into the RAM or create like an object of it, basically to understand how to create an object, the Python by default do that part on its own, right? But when you have this particular method defined, which is reduce, then the Python program or especially the pickle library is going to choose this particular method over the existing default setting. So for example, when we are going to deserialize the object, and if the object contains this particular method, the pickle library is going to ignore everything and going to first take a look at this reduce method to see that how the object needs to be constructed. It is as simple as that. Okay, so what basically we are doing is that when our goal is that when we give this particular class or this particular object or this particular serialized object as an input, the application tries to like deserialize it, then it goes to this particular function and this particular method, and in this particular method we are going to define something very critical, for example executing system commands or something like that, so that we can have a remote code execution. Okay, let's try to understand how we can do that. So we have this reduce function over here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do return os.system. Okay, this is the method that we're going to call os.system, which is basically going to execute system commands. Then we are going to call the command inside a tuple, which is who am I. As simple as that. Once we have done that, what we'll try to do is we'll try to create an object of this particular class. So I'm just going to do that. So let's create payload equals to ABC. We have the object created. Now we want to create like a serialized object of this, serialized data of it, right? So we'll do obj2, for example, pickle.dump s. We'll do payload, right? Then we are simply going to encode the payload to base 64 so that we can get a text format data. Encoded _2, we'll name it like that, base 64.b64 encode obj2.decode, and instead of printing the first object, we'll be printing encoded _2 like this. Okay, and we can now save this and try to execute the program. Let's type anything, let's type any username because it's not going to affect us, and this is the output that we've got. Now this is the serialized data of the malicious object that we have created. Okay, so we are simply going to copy this. Okay, and now we'll try to deserialize the text, the string. Okay, we're going to paste this and have a look at this, like what happens after this. So when you're going to hit enter, you can see we've got an error because the object didn't have isAdmin property. But if you take a closer look, we've got the output of the whoami command, which is root, right? So the moment the application tries to deserialize the data, it saw the reduce method and it went to that method, ignoring everything. It went to that method and saw that, okay, this is how you need to construct the object. We need to call this os.system with the value who am I, and that's what it did, and it was able to give us the output of who am I. Now this is just for the demonstration part. This is just to make you understand that how insecure deserialization works. Obviously in a real world application this varies a little bit, also depending on the language on which the application has been developed, because on many different languages, for example Java, .NET or etc., you can have a different alternative of this particular method, which is reduce, which is going to work in a very similar way, but the name and the functionality or the way to call it is very different. Okay, but more or less this is how insecure deserialization can lead to remote code execution. Okay, this is what insecure deserialization is. So just for a quick demonstration again, if we change this who am I to, for example, ls, save this back again, and if we go ahead and type code py, let's serialize the data. Okay, and if we go ahead and try to deserialize this data again it's going to call the reduce function, reduce method, right? And it's going to execute the command, and you can see this is the output that we've got. Like this is all the file present inside this particular directory, confirming that if the user input is not getting validated properly before deserializing, it can lead to a very critical vulnerability like this. Oftentimes insecure deserialization vulnerability can lead to always a critical or a remote code execution vulnerability, right? So this is how you can find insecure deserialization. This is how insecure deserialization works. This is what classes and oops are. I hope you guys have understood it. If you have any doubts, if you have any issues, feel free to let me know your doubts or issues in the comment section. And one more thing, I'm going to be creating a new video related to insecure deserialization, where we're going to talk about how we can find this kind of vulnerability in web applications, right? But before that, it was very important for you guys to understand what it really means, because unlike other vulnerabilities where you can just throw away some payloads and get the output, this vulnerability is very different, because in this vulnerability you need to understand some core basics of programming, what classes and objects are, and so on and so forth, right? I hope you guys were able to understand this. If you have any doubts, if you have any issues, feel free to let me know your doubts or issues in the comment section. And now with that being said, keep learning, keep hacking, and thank you so much for watching this video.